The city will always have interest just because of the amenities that are available to them.
Hello, and welcome to the Housing Insiders, the podcast for founders, builders, lenders, and regulators, and anyone who believes that everyone should be well housed. I'm Jonathan Lawless.
And I'm Jeremy Potter. On Housing Insiders, we aim to pull back the curtain, talk to those in the know, and discuss actionable ideas that you won't hear anywhere else.
Jeremy, I'm glad the NBA brought you to town to be in person for our first episode. So why don't you talk a little bit about why we're doing this?
John, I think we've had a lot of these conversations that we didn't record because we're both attracted to these really big challenges, the trouble innovating in the housing space, the way that everybody you mentioned in the intro has to work together to actually bring something to homeowners and potential homeowners that can work. So Housing Insiders hopes that we'll bring those conversations to a broader audience so that we can work together to find the solutions that are really going to challenge the next generation of homeowners.
So for our first episode, let's start by taking sort of a bird's eye view of what this issue is in housing, and namely an issue that gets talked about way too much, which is the supply issue. I mean, everywhere you turn, people are talking about supply. And what I consider the three most important aspects of the supply challenge, which is location, location, location.
And I think one of the things we hear a lot about that everybody discusses is the conversation around building cheaper homes, changing zoning rules, and how we'll see all this explosion of housing if only this and if only that. And the reality is there's a lot of lesser discussed drivers around the supply issue that we haven't seen people talking about. And I think that's how we want to dig into it today.
Exactly. Well, let's start by digging into what is actually happening with our cities today. I cannot tell you how excited I am to have Odeta with us. Odeta Kushi is the Deputy Chief Economist at First American Financial. If you don't know who they are, you really should, because they are, I think, the largest provider of title insurance and settlement services. Number one.
Fidelity and First American, we are like Pepsi and Coke.
Okay, yeah, just lie. Number one.
Number one. We'll take it. We'll take the win.
Odeta also has her own podcast called Reconomy, which if you don't listen to, you absolutely should. I listen to it religiously. She's amazing, super thoughtful. And so really, really happy to have you here to help us unpack this issue of the supply constraints, particularly how our American cities are failing to accommodate the needs that we have. So let me just start with a very basic question, probably one that you talk about all the time, which is if it is our major cities that are suffering the major supply constraints, that's probably where we're going to see the most home price growth as supply is constrained. Is that what we're seeing today?
Yeah, first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me and giving me the opportunity to be in your inaugural episode. I'm sure there's many more to come. This is a really fascinating question, and I spend too much time building house price indices and studying house price indices. So let me just set the stage. When I talk about house prices, I'm looking at a repeat sales index, which is sort of constant quality adjusted, right? So we're tracking the same house price over time. And when we do that by major metropolitan area, what we've found in our latest reports is that the places that have had the fastest growth are, well, regionally, it's the Northeast. It's places where inventory remains low compared to pre-pandemic. It's also an area that's more difficult to build, right? Think about the Bostons and the New Yorks of the world. The Midwest has also experienced some growth. I think that that's really sort of a relative affordability story. There are just markets that are more affordable that are getting some interest now. Places that are experiencing downward pressure on house prices in the South, predominantly Texas and Florida markets. These are places where inventory has picked up substantially. And so there are certainly regional differences. But even within those regional differences, I think that there are, different stories, right? So we have our markets like Austin and Phoenix that are your pandemic boom towns that had a lot of in-migration, a lot of building, a lot of investor activity, double-digit house price growth surpassing that of other major metropolitan areas. And those are places where we're starting to see a lot of downward pressure on prices as things sort of mean revert, if you will. And so that's a different story from the LAs of the world, where they're just traditionally more expensive markets. And so when mortgage rates increased as fast as they did, it sort of disproportionately hurt those traditionally more expensive markets. And so there's a lot of nuance in what's happening, but there is a very strong and positive correlation between, the more inventory you have, the more downward pressure on prices. And that makes sense, right? That's intuitive to us.
Supply and demand.
Supply and demand, 101.
Studied economics.
Yeah, exactly.
When you say double-digit growth in those markets, to me, that sounds like a meaningful trend, no matter what time in the market, no matter what year, that's a meaningful thing. When we talk about the number of housing units or supply in an area, are we really talking about that in the context of lowered expectations year over year, meaning what would have been a blip in supply 10 years ago is a big story in supply now because our relative expectations of what's on the market continue to get smaller and smaller? So are we really looking at any exciting news in supply, or are we really just looking at what is a blip, but we're now calling it exciting because we have so little options?
That's a really interesting point. I mean, the supply issue, I think we started talking about it maybe in 2015, 2016. Like we really started to notice some pressure on housing. And then the, economists started to mention, hey, it looks like we've been underbuilding, relative to new household formation since maybe 2009. Whereas prior to that, we really were overbuilding relative to new household formation. And so I think it became sort of a cumulative story where, not only did we start to see the demographics pick up, you started to see millennials, the largest living generation, age into their prime home buying years, but you had this growing deficit of housing because we were underbuilding. And then we had mortgage rates of 3% and below, which really pulled forward a ton of demand. And I think that's really what got the headlines on the supply story is, Econ 101, rising demographic demand against relatively fixed supply is a recipe for rapid house price growth. And that's exactly what we saw, not just in Phoenix, but nationally as well. It was just more pronounced in Phoenix and Austin.
So as millennials demand certain cities, home prices go up because the response of the supply side just wasn't there. I want to talk about a couple of cities that I just think are interesting to think about. One, I'll pick on Detroit, because Detroit, I think, most recently had one of the highest paced home price growths, which is a little bit of a surprise. And for the first time in 50 years, the population of Detroit actually increased. I have this weird thought that that as home prices go up, it should be a place where the population is growing, right? Where a lot of people are trying to move there. But I'm really struggling to see that correlation. Maybe, and using another city, maybe Houston might be an interesting example of where the population is actually growing quickly because they can respond with more supply. But anyway, can you talk about just like where are millennials choosing to move? Yeah. Is the population actually growing in those locations? How does that interact with home prices?
That's a great question. So millennials, what we've seen in the net migration data, domestic net in, net out migration of young people. So let's just say 25 to 34-year-olds. We've seen out migration out of traditionally more expensive markets like New York, LA, Miami, and net in migration into relatively more affordable markets and markets with strong job growth, right? So your Sunbelt markets, like again, your Austin, your San Antonios. And so that's sort of what we've been seeing. And that's the general population trend as well. That's not just sort of if we extrapolate to the broader population, not just young people, we've seen growth in Sunbelt markets and movement away from traditionally less affordable markets like LA. And so, millennials are searching for relative affordability, and of course, jobs. And I think that's always the story, right? Is where you see a thriving economy is where you'll see net in-migration. The Detroit story, that's a relatively more affordable market. I'm personally a huge fan of Detroit, so my bias might be showing here. So I think it's a great and growing market. It's also more affordable, and a millennial can afford to buy a home there. And yeah, we've seen a stronger growth in Detroit and some other Midwestern markets.
Well, I'm certainly happy to be surrounded by people who share my passion for Detroit and the next belt. But that brings up the question, John, around if I can afford a market that maybe I had my eye on or might actually trigger migration of some kind. It comes back to what Odeta just said, the job market. So, you and I talk about this a lot. You come back to the question of remote work and what effect that will have on cities. For a place like Detroit, it should be actually a benefit that you could live in Detroit, have access to a world-class airport, still get wherever you need to go and work for potentially anyone. But I don't know if we're actually seeing that affect cities. I don't know what your take would be on either Detroit or any of these cities relative to remote work.
I mean, let's turn to the data. What does economic migration look like? And again, I think what's interesting to what Odeta just shared is you take all these mega cities that we have that are completely inflexible to growth. And if you are a company, do you want to be in those mega cities? Do you want to be in New York or Miami? Or do you want to be in Austin, where you actually could attract talent because it's a fun place, but there's also space to grow? And so I don't know if companies are just relocating to where they can have people in office, or if companies are staying where they are today and people are just moving elsewhere and remote working. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the remote work story, we still don't know how that's going to totally shake out. I do think that everyone's pretty much aligned that there is a permanent reduction in the need of office space, and that hybrid work is certainly here to stay. But, how much or how little remains to be seen, I think, in the years to come. Certainly, employers could push for some return to office as they have, but I do think that by and large, hybrid work is here to stay. What we saw over the pandemic was a trend that was that preceded the pandemic, but was accelerated by the ability to work remotely. And that was a general sort of shift of particularly millennials from the urban core out to the suburbs and exurbs. But for me, one of the most interesting things was this sort of donut effect, where the people moved is where retail followed, is where office demand followed, is where, commercial demand followed. And that's an important trend to watch. We started to see price growth in some of these commercial properties, in the suburbs exceed that of the urban core. And so this idea of, the economy will follow. It's not permanent reduction in demand in the urban core. It's a shift of demand to where the people are moving. And the people, millennials specifically, were doing what generations had done before them, which is start to have a family and move out to the burbs and the exurbs. And I think we're still seeing that trend. Millennials were leading the revitalization of the city in the 2000s and early 2010s, and now they're sort of leading that shift to the suburbs and exurbs.
That sounds awful to me. And the reason I say that, I'm curious to get your thoughts, but if the hypothesis is right, that our cities have failed, they have failed because we can't change zoning and we can't build public transportation. And so we're stuck with bad cities that are inflexible. What are you going to do as a home buyer, as a millennial who is looking for a place to live and maybe doesn't make $500,000 per year? What do you do? And if the answer to that question is you create what your parents did, which is this automobile-centric donut ring outside of a cool city, where if you do have to go to the office, you're looking at a 45-minute commute, what kind of life is that? What kind of choice is that our millennials are facing? I mean, what the hell?
I agree that the idea that you would spend any time in the car more than you had to make the commute to a place that apparently just moved all the things you liked to you, right? That is saying like everything's moving to where those individuals are anyhow. So they end up telling themselves a story about the move and then just finding out that everything moved to them and then just staying in that area anyway. The question, if I was making a decision, especially around housing, it's how dependent is my housing decision or my housing investment, either as a policymaker or an enabler of housing units, creator of housing is now I'm subject to whether companies are more resilient to moving their offices or that the talent is going to draw the company out. And I got to decide for my city or my region, if you're in the different regions that you just mentioned, that's a really tough call to have to guess that or make strategic decisions off of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're sort of asking two questions. It's, how do we maybe revitalize our downtown areas is maybe one. And then maybe the separate one is how do we accommodate the fact that maybe our cities aren't doing enough? And so how do we then accommodate elsewhere, movements to other parts of the country, to more affordable areas, to exurb, to suburbs, to developing rural areas, whatever it may be. I think maybe we're sort of asking two of those.
I think that's exactly right. Those are, and for our next part, we need to get to ideas here because that's what this show is about, is like understanding what really is driving what's happening in housing, and then based on that, figuring out what we should do about it. I want to get a quick plug in for our sponsor, Bilt Rewards. Bilt is a rewards program, just like an airline program, that is centered around the home. Instead of earning miles for flying, with Bilt Rewards, you earn points for paying your rent, no matter how you pay. As a member, you can also earn points at over 20,000 restaurants, local merchants, the list goes on and on. You can use it to book travel, you can use it on Amazon, you can even save your points for a down payment on a home. So imagine a world where every type of housing payment, be it on your rent, on condo fees, on your mortgage, allows you to earn rewards and access a huge number of other benefits. Imagine as a housing provider being able to use points to incentivize good behavior like paying rent on time. Bilt is revolutionizing housing. If you want to learn more, email me at lawless@biltrewards.com.
Odeta, you mentioned that there are all of these constraints creating what John referred to and what you referred to as a donut effect around our cities. And we've heard a lot about these big headline topics about saving housing in cities or doing things. Office conversions to residential housing might be a good example. There's plenty of other examples. What are you actually seeing?
Office conversions to specifically multifamily properties have been a big headline. And certainly we've seen it grow substantially. I think it was, from 2021 to 2024, the number of apartments scheduled to be converted from office space quadrupled, from 12,000 to 55,000. But what does that mean as a share of the number of multifamily units under construction? It's about 6% of total new supply. And if we look at the total housing stock of apartments, it's something like 0.2%. So it's not making a huge dent in the available supply. Specifically here, I'm talking about apartments. And it's just really expensive to do office to multifamily conversions. And so it's not a practical and sustainable solution. I think there are other things you can do with office space. You can turn it to maybe life sciences. You can do student housing type situation. There's a lot that I think that we can start to think about how to use some of this obsolete office space, but the conversions shouldn't be as much of a headline as it has been.
Yeah, I know you guys probably don't agree with my sort of death of the city in America view, because our cities cannot become what European or Chinese cities are. They will fail to do that. And you guys believe that there is a way to do more infill into the cities. But let me talk a little bit why I think the city is dead, okay? In the last 25 years, really my lifetime in DC, just to use an anecdote, I've seen the city go from nothing to an amazing, immaculate city. Now, it is starting to back off, and I think all of that happened because millennials had this, and I think, Odeta, you said this earlier, they wanted to urbanize. They wanted to live in these hip, cool urban neighborhoods, okay? Now, suddenly jobs are not in those offices downtown. Those downtowns are missing people during the day. And this idea that now millennials are going to choose to live in their cubicle. Like, let's take their crappy office in a crappy part of town and have them live in their cubicle. To me, just sounds like the most ridiculous thing ever. People want space. They've been doing this forever. They go in, they have a young urban lifestyle, and then they decide, hey, I might want to get married and have kids, and I want to have space. Now, I don't subscribe to the McMansion thing. I think that's too much space. But I definitely do not subscribe to like, let's stay in the city and live in my office building as a solution. So, Odeta, I think your alternative, first of all, it's impossible. And I think, Odeta, you painted that reason very well. But honestly, my solution, tear that stuff down. Okay, we don't need massive office buildings anymore. We need green space, and we need places that people actually want to go to. And it is not a residential tower surrounded by nothing.
Well, I think we're all aligned that mixed use is sort of the way to go, right? You need to have residential space, you need to have some retail space, a little bit of office space. I think that's really the answer when we can get it. But the city will always have interest just because of the amenities that are available to them. So sure, millennials are, moving out to the suburbs and exurbs because they're having families and they need more space, and the city doesn't afford them that space. It's also expensive to live in that core downtown area. But Gen Z is right behind them. And I think they still crave that interaction, that accessibility, the walkability, the restaurants, the bars, and maybe to some extent the co-working space that a lot of these offices are being converted to. And so I do think that there's that element still at play.
I think the other thing that's a trend that is definitely a macro trend we have very little data on, but it's that consumers and home buyers in particular, but those with extra income have been primed for a new big solution in a bunch of different areas of their lives. And we've not yet seen someone try the new big solution that would address some of the issues that you're talking about. And I think millennials in particular, Gen Z, there's actually a density factor. They do want to live close. We do want to live close to each other. We want to be close to each other near those amenities Odeta mentioned. So I think the conversion may not be the solution, but this idea of being together, I think, is part of the trend I would look out for.
Yeah. I mean, if something's going to drive Gen Zers back to the office, back to downtowns, it's not going to be what drove millennials there. It may be something that looks really different. I mean, Gen Zers don't have that same background millennials did, where like the office happy hour was their main thing that drove their social life. They just have a different world, which is online. And I'm not saying we need a Ready Player One downtown area where you go downtown and you plug in and then you don't talk to anybody. We might still need some human connection, but I am seeing a Ready Player One future, and I just don't see a downtown. Now, a Ready Player One future, what does that look like? Maybe it is like containers that you sort of go into and have like a virtual reality around you, and you can do it in a sort of pretty green area in a downtown space. I mean, that sounds crazy. We'll never be able to do that, but I'm trying to think outside of the box a little bit.
Well, let's think outside the box a little bit. Odeta, the one question that comes up here is around the amount of space I need, right? John mentioned it with McMansions. We're now talking about like this kind of work-life balance, for lack of a better way to say that, because that used to mean something else. But now we're talking about it in terms of how I actually architect the space that I live and work in. So is there a trend? Are you seeing anything that says that millennials or Gen Z might be thinking differently about the space they need relative to the size of our homes?
I think so. You know, this untethering from the office has given our homes this multi-purpose. It's not just a home, it's our gym, it's our office, it's our daycare center, right? Like there are so many uses for the home rather than just a wealth generating asset or the place where we, eat and sleep. And so I do think that having a little bit more green space, having space to accommodate an office is certainly something that I know I was thinking about in the midst of the pandemic. That's sort of what prompted me to buy my home, is this idea that I'm working from home all of a sudden, and my marriage is going to fall apart if both of us are taking meetings in the same living room, right? Like that's just not sustainable. And so we need to have separate office spaces. And I think that's certainly something that people are considering. Interestingly, builders are building smaller and smaller homes because the affordability constraints, the cost to build is just so high, and we do need more affordable solutions. And so that the homes are getting a little bit smaller, the new construction homes.
And John, one of the things that you and I have worked on for years and not been able to find a good solution for is the true cost of home ownership, right? We don't really know month over month operations and maintenance, insurance, energy consumption. These are all variables, and they're getting, it seems, more widely variant rather than more predictable. And we have more data. So I was also curious if like size related to cost, not just of obtaining the home that Odeta mentioned earlier, home price, but then also like what it costs me month over month for energy or for these different things that in some ways density is more efficient.
Well, I think when you talk about amenities and the value of the city, it's always been that sort of thing where sort of roads are cheaper if they're serving thousands of people versus 10. And so to your point, the cost of living within a city is potentially lower in a smaller place. However, I mean, Odeta mentioned one of the costs, divorce, which I often think about the same. Like if me and my family were forced to live in 1,000 square feet, like that would be on the agenda, I'm sure, for my wife. And so, there are other costs of living in small areas that at the end of the day, the alternative costs are commute times. I think you're making a good point, the correlation of size and cost of a home. But like, again, I think there's so many other social costs that are impossible to measure. Commute times, being close to other people is great unless they play the tuba at 2 a.m, right? I mean, there are a lot of considerations, I think, that go into where people choose to live and whether or not the city or densification of the city or office conversions is going to meet those needs at a cost point that actually makes sense.
Yeah. And I think builders are sort of adapting to some of those. I think common spaces have become more popular in a lot of the new construction apartment buildings, sort of trying to accommodate for the fact that we want more space. We want some, time together. We were, kept from the world for some time over the pandemic, and we're missing socialization and, rooftops with pools and green space and things. So I do think that construction trends adapt to the wants and needs in the city, but certainly, again, I'm living proof that I'm still technically in DC, but you could argue I'm in the suburbs of DC.
You're in the suburbs.
Okay, John's going to be more definitive about it. I like to think I'm still cool and in the city.
Yeah, it makes the kind of urban infill in Detroit the massive exception, not the trend for cities across the country, is what we're saying. There may be a city that is able to do infill. To your point, there are not going to be a trend of cities who figure this out.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the question is, for a certain subset of cities that I think are the biggest failures in terms of being able to accommodate more people, infill is just going to lead to disaster. And where we're trying to do these solutions without really being able to fix the problem, which is massively rezone our cities and build much more effective public transportation. If we can't do that, we're just going to make these cities more and more miserable. In other words, the trade-offs are just going to get exacerbated. And so that kind of gets to the second question, which is, if for a second we agree that some cities, maybe not all cities, cannot accommodate the type of density that you guys like, that I don't like, but that it can accommodate some of that, where do people go then? What is the migratory pattern out of those sort of overly densified cities? What are the alternatives? And is the alternative just Detroit?
Are we seeing a trend around, or how would you think about the data around millennials or Gen Z being willing to move for things like climate change and sustainability, or some of the remote work?
I think I can maybe speak to more of the anecdata than the data at this point. I certainly know that there's a lot of concern about the impacts of climate change, both from a financial perspective, which is what are premiums going to look like? Will insurance be offered in some of these popular areas more at climate risk? So there's a financial consideration of, maybe I move to my hometown of Rochester, New York, which is a little bit more climate resistant. So I do think that there's that aspect. There's also just a sort of relative affordability story here. I do think that we are seeing movement in, again, Midwestern markets, some more affordable markets that offer amenities. So you do need to have job growth, or maybe you work remotely and you keep your California salary and you move to, to Detroit with that California salary. But I think that there's that aspect of it as well, is I want to be able to have my piece of the American dream. I want to be able to afford a home. I can't afford it in New York City. And so maybe I move out to where my parents are, and in Detroit. I keep using Detroit as the example because I can't afford to buy there, and there are some amenities being offered to me, and I get childcare. That's the other thing, right? Is childcare. We didn't touch on that, but this is a generation that's aging into their the lifestyle decisions, like getting married and having kids, and childcare is very expensive in DC. Maybe Jonathan, about that, but
oh God, it's so bad. Well, look, I think to the point, childcare is ridiculously expensive. If I want to go anywhere besides my neighborhood, it takes me forever. And that's not even mentioning the fact that occasionally NATO will show up and close down half the city, right? So DC is a really complicated place to live. And so if I were sort of answering your question, Jeremy, and thinking about out migration patterns, what do people really want? And I think they want a safe, walkable neighborhood that has some of the city amenities, that has space for to live, but not necessarily a McMansion. And that's affordable. At the end of the day, that's not in the cities that we see today. And so what I would be thinking is, how do I attract companies to new small cities? I always use Dayton as an example because I think it's really shocking that Dayton, Ohio, home to a lot of GM employees in the past, only has 46% of their housing structures occupied. Dayton has the opposite of a supply problem. They just have an oversupply problem, which is crazy to me that we sort of jam ourselves into these other cities and leave all of these great cities in, climate safe zones that have infrastructure and nobody's using it. And so at the end of the day, the policies that I would sort of encourage is go take and rebuild these areas. If you're a company, go find ways to attract people to those spots. Our parents' generation kind of went through the same thing. They created these little box on the hilltop suburbs, right? The boomers sort of thought, I don't want to jam myself in a city. I want to go and live in these beautiful places. And the automobile and the GI Bill, it all kind of created this ability for us to spread out. And it changed the ideal of what people wanted. They didn't want that small apartment in New York City. Most people wanted that house on the hilltop. And so I think the next generation might want that. And if we want to take advantage of that as businesses, as lenders, as policymakers, we should figure out how to facilitate movement back into places that have existing infrastructure, build a city-like atmosphere in those places, encourage companies to move there. And I guarantee that will be way cheaper than trying to convert offices or change zoning or talk about changing zoning for the next 20 years.
I agree. I think that makes a very compelling case for looking at the costs that we described, the risks that we described, all the way across from climate to childcare and everything in between. You actually have to look at it holistically and say, this is the way we're going to create a more stable economy for a generation of people. And so how do we then put things in place that makes that possible for them? And then leave it up to the market to decide, who moves where for which job in which house, right? And we know history repeats itself. So there was a generation of people who did move for a job in a house, and a lot of it was to the Midwest. And so could that happen again? I think the answer we're saying is maybe.
Or it should.
It should. That's a good way to describe it.
Yeah. And if we can just bring it back full circle to real estate is local, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we're painting with a broad stroke when we're saying cities, but MSAs all tell a different story. So when we look at affordability by major metropolitan area, we find that there are several markets that are still more affordable, Louisville and Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, these markets that have a lot to offer in the way of amenities. And, Philadelphia has so many sort of cultural landmarks and there's so much there that are still relatively more affordable to a potential first-time home buyer. And so, of course, there's the LAs of the world and Miamis and New York that we all know are a little bit more cost prohibitive for a potential first-time home buyer. But there are still markets out there that are relatively more affordable that have a lot to offer.
Yeah, I think what we're saying is like Miami, New York, LA, always going to be cool. And we'll actually have short-term stays in those empty buildings in those cities when we need to go there for the project or for work for a short period of time, but we won't be there permanently if this more attainable housing solution actually comes to reality.
Yeah, I agree. I love that you mentioned Cleveland. I think the question for policymakers is two parts. One is, how do you encourage that? And I think ultimately it's about jobs need to move there, high-paying jobs. And as long as high-paying jobs continue to conglomerate, whatever the fancy word that they use, in super expensive markets, those markets are going to continue to break and cause misery for everybody that lives there. But as soon as we find a way to put those jobs in places like Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Louisville, so on and so forth, and then build an economy around that, we will all be happier, and it'll be a much cheaper, easier solution for anybody who's in housing, and create tons of interesting business models for us to consider.
Odeta, thank you, because you took us on a journey that took John from the death of the American city to the most hopeful picture I've heard yet of what we need to do to recapture the economic power of home ownership. So thank you.
I'll take it. I think we also all had an opportunity to pitch our hometowns, which is also great.
Absolutely. I might need to change it from the next belt to the Lakes belt or something, because what I'm hearing is, as much as I like to call Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, and Louisville the next belt, it's going to be about fresh water. And we may need to get the lakes in there to really capture that.
You heard it here first, folks. The lake belt. I like that.
All right. Well, that does it for this episode. Of course, we would love to hear from you. Please send an email to us if you have comments on anything that we've talked about at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com. And then, of course, smash that subscribe button. Is that the lingo that people use?
That's what the kids are saying.
Please smash the subscribe button and continue to follow and listen in.